The morning rain fell softly on the concrete outside Buckingham Palace as James Mitchell pulled his torn military jacket tighter around his shoulders. The jacket was old and dirty now, but it still carried the marks of honor from his 22 years of service to his country. He sat quietly on the cold ground with his back against the tall iron fence that separated him from the grand palace where the royal family lived. James had been coming to this same spot every morning for 3 months now. He was not like the other homeless people who sometimes gathered around the tourist areas of London. He did not beg for money or shout at the passing crowds. Instead, he sat with dignity and watched the world go by while holding a small photograph close to his chest. The photo showed a beautiful woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. This was Sarah, his beloved wife, who had died 6 months ago after a long battle with cancer. The tourists walked past James without really seeing him. They were too busy taking pictures of the palace guards in their bright red uniforms and tall black hats. Children pointed excitedly at the guards who stood perfectly still like statues. Parents smiled and took photos while tour guides explained the history of the famous palace. But nobody noticed the man in the faded military uniform who sat quietly nearby. James remembered when he used to be like those guards. He had served his country with pride in places far from home, where danger was always present. He had been a sergeant in the British Army, and his soldiers had looked up to him for leadership and protection. He had medals in a box somewhere that proved his bravery and dedication. But those medals could not help him now when he needed help the most. Everything had started to go wrong after Sarah got sick. The cancer treatments were expensive and took a long time. James had to take leave from his job to care for her because she was too weak to be alone. He spent all their savings on medicines and special treatments that the doctors said might help her get better. When Sarah died, James felt like his whole world had fallen apart. Without Sarah and without his job, James could not pay for their small house anymore. The bank sent him letters demanding money he did not have. Government offices sent him from one department to another, with forms to fill out and promises of help that never came. Everyone told him to wait and be patient, but James was running out of time and money. Finally, the bank took his house and James found himself living on the streets for the first time in his life. He chose to come to Buckingham Palace because it reminded him of why he had served his country. The palace represented everything he had fought to protect during his years as a soldier. James hoped that someone important might notice him here and listen to his story. He believed that if people knew how the system had failed him, they might want to help other soldiers who were in similar situations. Each morning, James would clean himself as best he could in the public toilets nearby. He would comb his gray hair and try to make his old uniform look respectable. Then he would walk to his spot by the palace fence and sit down to begin another day of waiting. He never caused trouble or bothered anyone. He simply existed in the shadow of the great palace, hoping that someone would care enough to help. The other homeless people in the area thought James was foolish to waste his time sitting by the palace. They told him that rich people and important officials did not care about poor people like them. But James refused to give up hope. He had spent too many years protecting his country to believe that his country would completely abandon him in return. As the morning grew brighter, James watched the palace guards change their positions during their duty rotations. He noticed the same faces appearing day after day, and wondered if any of these men might understand what it felt like to serve and then be forgotten. Little did James know that one of those guards had already begun to notice him and would soon change both of their lives forever. Sergeant Thomas Reynolds had been a royal guard at Buckingham Palace for 15 years. Every morning he put on his bright red uniform with its golden buttons and placed the tall black bearskin hat carefully on his head. He took great pride in his job protecting the royal family and maintaining the traditions that tourists from around the world came to see. Thomas was known among his fellow guards as someone who took his duties very seriously and never broke the rules. But something about the homeless man sitting by the palace fence had caught Thomas' attention over the past few weeks. Unlike the other people who sometimes gathered in the area, this man was different. He sat with his back straight and his head held high even though his clothes were dirty and worn. There was something about the way he carried himself that reminded Thomas of his own father, who had also been a soldier many years ago. During his morning patrol, Thomas found himself looking toward the spot where James sat each day. He noticed that the man never asked tourists for money or caused any disturbance. Instead, he would sit quietly watching the palace guards with what looked like respect and understanding. Thomas began to wonder what this man's story might be and why he chose to spend his days in this particular place. On a cold Tuesday morning, when there were fewer tourists than usual, Thomas made a decision that would change everything. During his scheduled break, he walked over to where James was sitting and stood nearby for a moment. James looked up at the tall guard in his impressive uniform, and immediately his tired face brightened with recognition. Without hesitation, James struggled to his feet and gave Thomas a proper military salute. His movements were still sharp and precise despite months of living on the streets. Thomas was surprised by the quality of the salute and instinctively returned it with equal respect. In that moment, both men recognized something in each other that went beyond their current circumstances. Thomas asked James if he had served in the military, and James' eyes lit up with pride as he began to share his story. He told Thomas about his 22 years as a sergeant in the British Army and about the places he had been stationed around the world. James spoke about his fellow soldiers and the missions they had completed together. His voice grew stronger as he remembered the man he used to be before everything fell apart. As James continued talking, Thomas realized they had actually served in some of the same regions, though at different times. They discovered they knew some of the same people and had experienced similar challenges during their military service. Thomas found himself drawn into James' story and began to understand how this decorated veteran had ended up homeless outside the palace gates. James explained about Sarah, his wife, who had died from cancer, and how caring for her had cost him everything he owned. He described the frustrating visits to government offices, where he was told to fill out forms and wait for help that never seemed to come. James' voice became quiet and sad as he talked about losing his home and finding himself with nowhere to go except the streets of London. Thomas listened with growing anger as he heard how the system had failed someone who had given so much to his country. He thought about his own comfortable life and secure job while this fellow soldier struggled just to survive each day. Thomas began to understand that James was not just another homeless person, but a brother in arms who deserved much better treatment from the nation he had served with honor. When Thomas' break time was over, he reluctantly returned to his post, but his mind kept returning to James' story. That evening, Thomas went home to his small apartment and could not stop thinking about what he had learned. He realized that simply knowing about James' situation was not enough. Something had to be done to help this forgotten soldier who had been abandoned by the very country he had sworn to protect. The next morning, Thomas arrived at work with James' story still heavy on his mind. He had spent most of the night thinking about what he had learned and felt a strong urge to do something meaningful to help his fellow veteran. Thomas knew that the Royal Guard had strict rules about their behavior and duties, but he also knew that sometimes doing the right thing required taking risks. During the morning briefing, Thomas approached his commanding officer, Captain Williams. Captain Williams was a stern man in his 50s who had served in the military before joining the Palace Guard. Thomas respected his captain, but also knew that Williams followed rules very strictly and did not like it when guards stepped outside their assigned duties. Thomas carefully explained the situation about James and asked if there might be some official way to help the homeless veteran. He suggested that perhaps the palace could connect James with proper veteran services or provide some kind of assistance through official channels. Thomas tried to present his request in a professional manner that would not sound like he was questioning the established procedures. Captain Williams listened to Thomas with a serious expression on his face. When Thomas finished speaking, the captain reminded him that Royal Guards had very specific responsibilities that did not include getting involved in civilian matters. Williams explained that the palace had clear protocols about dealing with people who gathered in the public areas around the grounds. The captain told Thomas that homeless people, including veterans, were the responsibility of local authorities and social services, not the Royal Guard. Williams pointed out that if guards started helping individual people, it could create problems and set dangerous precedents. He reminded Thomas that their job was to protect the royal family and maintain security, not to solve social problems. Captain Williams then gave Thomas a direct order to ensure that James moved along from his spot by the palace fence, just like any other person who might cause disruption to the tourist area. The captain explained that allowing someone to camp indefinitely outside the palace sent the wrong message and could encourage others to do the same thing. Thomas felt his heart sink as he listened to these instructions. He understood the logic behind the rules, but he also felt that blindly following protocol in this situation would be morally wrong. James was not causing any problems or bothering anyone. He was simply a forgotten soldier who needed help from the country he had served with distinction. After the briefing, Thomas returned to his post feeling torn between his duty to follow orders and his personal conviction that James deserved better treatment. He watched James sitting quietly in his usual spot and felt angry that bureaucratic rules were preventing him from helping someone who truly needed assistance. Throughout the day, Thomas found himself thinking about his own military service and the bonds he had formed with fellow soldiers. He remembered how important it was to never leave a man behind and to always look out for your brothers in arms. The idea of simply moving James along like an unwanted pest went against everything Thomas believed about loyalty and honor. As his shift ended, Thomas made a decision that would put his entire career at risk. He realized that sometimes following orders was not the same as doing what was right. Thomas decided that he would find a way to help James, even if it meant breaking protocol and facing serious consequences from his superiors. That evening, Thomas went home and began researching veterans' rights and support services on his computer. He made phone calls to local charities and advocacy groups, trying to understand what options might be available for someone in James' situation. Thomas discovered that James' case was unfortunately not unique, and that many veterans were struggling with similar problems. Thomas realized that helping James might require more than just finding him a place to sleep. It might require bringing public attention to a much larger problem that was affecting hundreds of forgotten soldiers across the country. Over the next several days, Thomas spent every free moment researching veterans' issues and support systems. He visited websites of charitable organizations and read newspaper articles about soldiers who had struggled after returning home from military service. The more Thomas learned, the more frustrated he became with how poorly the system was treating people who had sacrificed so much for their country. Thomas discovered that waiting lists for veterans' housing assistance often stretched for months or even years. Mental health services were overwhelmed and underfunded. Many former soldiers fell through the cracks of bureaucracy, just like James had experienced. Thomas realized that James was not lazy or unwilling to help himself, but rather a victim of a broken system that had failed to keep its promises to those who served. During his shifts, Thomas continued to check on James during patrol breaks. He began bringing sandwiches and hot coffee from the palace staff kitchen. Other guards started to notice Thomas' unusual behavior, and some began asking questions about why he was spending time with the homeless man by the fence. Some of Thomas' fellow guards were supportive when they learned about James' military background. Guard Michael Chen told Thomas about his own grandfather, who had struggled with similar problems after serving in World War II. Guard David Murphy shared that his brother had difficulty accessing veterans' benefits after serving in Iraq. These conversations helped Thomas realize that many people had personal connections to veterans' issues. However, other guards were worried about Thomas' actions and warned him that he was taking dangerous risks. They reminded him that Captain Williams had given clear orders about moving James along, and that disobeying direct orders could result in serious disciplinary action, including losing his job. Some guards feared that Thomas' behavior might reflect poorly on the entire unit. Thomas appreciated both the support and the warnings from his colleagues, but he felt compelled to continue helping James. He had made contact with several journalists who specialized in writing about veterans' affairs. One reporter named Sarah Henderson seemed particularly interested in James' story and agreed to meet with both men to learn more about the situation. Sarah Henderson had written many articles about problems in the veterans support system and had won awards for her investigative reporting on military issues. When she met James and heard his complete story, she immediately recognized the potential for a powerful article that could bring attention to widespread problems affecting many veterans. Sarah explained to Thomas that publishing James' story could have major consequences for everyone involved. Thomas would likely face disciplinary action from palace officials for speaking to the media without authorization. James would suddenly find himself in the public spotlight, which could be overwhelming for someone who had been living quietly on the streets. Despite these risks, Thomas decided to proceed with Sarah's plan to write an article about James' situation. He felt that bringing public attention to the problem was the only way to create real change that could help not just James, but many other veterans who were struggling in similar circumstances. Thomas met with Sarah several times to provide background information and to help her understand the full scope of the problem. He shared his research about veteran services and explained how the palace protocol prevented guards from helping people like James, even when it was clearly the right thing to do. Sarah warned Thomas that once the article was published, there would be intense media attention and scrutiny. Palace officials would be angry about the unauthorized publicity, and Thomas' career as a royal guard would probably be over. However, Thomas had already made peace with these potential consequences because he believed that some things were more important than job security. James was initially hesitant about having his story told in the newspapers because he was a private person who did not like being the center of attention. However, Thomas convinced him that sharing his experience could help other veterans avoid similar struggles and might lead to improvements in the support systems that had failed him. As Sarah prepared to publish her article, Thomas felt both nervous and excited about what might happen next. He knew that his life was about to change dramatically, but he also felt proud that he was taking a stand for someone who deserved better treatment from his country. Sarah Henderson's article was published on a Wednesday morning in one of London's biggest newspapers. The headline read "Royal Guard Breaks Protocol to Help Forgotten War Hero" and featured a large photograph of James sitting outside Buckingham Palace in his worn military uniform. The article told James' complete story from his years of distinguished service to his current struggle with homelessness after losing everything while caring for his dying wife. The article also included quotes from Thomas about his decision to help James despite palace rules that prohibited such involvement. Thomas explained his belief that fellow soldiers should never abandon each other and that sometimes doing the right thing required taking personal risks. The article described how broken systems had failed James and highlighted the broader problem affecting many veterans across the country. Within hours of publication, the story began spreading rapidly across social media platforms. People shared the article on Facebook and Twitter with comments expressing outrage that a decorated veteran was living on the streets while bureaucrats ignored his needs. Many readers shared their own stories about family members who had struggled with similar problems after military service. The palace telephone system was quickly overwhelmed with calls from citizens demanding to know why a war hero was being treated so poorly. Some callers were angry at the palace for not helping James, while others praised Thomas for his courage in breaking rules to do what was right. Local television news programs picked up the story and sent reporters to interview James outside the palace gates. James found himself surrounded by journalists and camera crews asking him to repeat his story and share his feelings about the sudden attention. The shy veteran was uncomfortable with the spotlight, but tried to answer questions politely, while emphasizing that his situation was not unique among former soldiers who needed help from their country. Meanwhile, inside the palace, Walls' senior officials were meeting in emergency sessions to discuss how to handle the growing crisis. Palace administrators were furious about the unauthorized media coverage and the way it made the royal household appear uncaring toward veterans. They were particularly angry with Thomas for violating protocol by speaking to reporters without permission. Captain Williams was ordered to suspend Thomas immediately pending a full investigation into his conduct. Thomas was told to remove his uniform and turn in his weapons and identification before being escorted from the palace grounds. As word spread among the other guards about Thomas' suspension, many of his colleagues felt conflicted about whether he had done the right thing or made a serious mistake. The story continued to gain momentum throughout the day as more news outlets picked it up and expanded their coverage. Television reporters interviewed military experts and veterans advocates who explained how common James' situation had become and how inadequate the current support systems were for former soldiers transitioning back to civilian life. Social media users began creating hashtags like Help James Mitchell and Support for Veterans to draw more attention to the story. Celebrities and politicians started commenting on the situation, with many praising Thomas for his compassion while criticizing the systems that had failed James so completely. By evening, the story had spread beyond London to national news networks and was being covered by international media outlets. Photographs of James sitting outside Buckingham Palace appeared on websites and newspapers around the world as his story became a symbol of how modern societies sometimes abandon the very people who sacrifice to protect them. Veterans organizations across Britain began issuing statements supporting both James and Thomas, while calling for immediate reforms to improve services for former military personnel. Charity groups that worked with homeless veterans reported receiving hundreds of phone calls from people wanting to donate money or volunteer their time to help. An online petition demanding that Thomas be reinstated rather than punished began circulating and quickly gathered thousands of signatures. The petition argued that Thomas had demonstrated exactly the kind of values and character that the Royal Guard should represent, and that punishing him would send the wrong message to the public. As the first day of media coverage came to an end, both James and Thomas realized that their lives had been permanently changed by the decision to share this story with the world. James was no longer an invisible homeless man, but the center of a national conversation about veterans' rights. Thomas was no longer an anonymous palace guard, but a symbol of moral courage who had risked everything to help a fellow soldier in need. The second day brought even more intense media attention as the story continued to spread across television news programs and social media platforms. Buckingham Palace found itself dealing with a public relations crisis unlike anything they had experienced in recent years. The royal household, which usually controlled its public image very carefully, was now at the center of a controversy that seemed to grow larger by the hour. Palace officials held urgent meetings throughout the morning trying to decide how to respond to the situation. Some advisors suggested that they should defend Thomas' suspension by emphasizing the importance of following established protocols and maintaining discipline among the palace staff. Other advisors warned that taking a hard line against Thomas could make the palace appear heartless and unsympathetic to veterans' issues. A palace press office was flooded with interview requests from journalists wanting official statements about James' situation and Thomas' punishment. Reporters camped outside the palace gates, asking every palace employee they could find for comments about the unfolding drama. Security had to be increased to manage the growing crowds of supporters and protesters who gathered to show their feelings about the controversy. Television news programs featured debates between military experts, veterans advocates, and royal commentators discussing whether Thomas had done the right thing by breaking protocol to help James. Most experts supported Thomas' actions while acknowledging that his methods had created problems for palace authorities who were responsible for maintaining order and security. The online petition supporting Thomas' reinstatement continued to grow rapidly, reaching over 50,000 signatures by midday. People from all walks of life added their names, including military veterans, their family members, and ordinary citizens who admired Thomas' courage. The petition comments section filled with personal stories from people who had experienced similar struggles with veteran services. Meanwhile, James found his temporary situation improving as several veterans' charities reached out to offer immediate assistance. A homeless shelter that specialized in helping former military personnel provided him with clean clothes and a temporary place to stay. Social workers began the process of helping him access the veterans' benefits and medical care he had been trying to obtain for months. However, James remained deeply worried about Thomas, who was facing serious consequences for trying to help him. The veteran felt guilty that his rescuer was now in trouble because of his decision to share his story with the media. James gave several interviews emphasizing that Thomas was a hero who deserved recognition rather than punishment for his compassionate actions. Conservative members of Parliament began asking questions in the House of Commons about why veteran services had failed someone like James, who had served his country with distinction. Opposition politicians demanded investigations into the veterans' support system and called for immediate reforms to prevent similar cases from occurring in the future. Veterans groups organized peaceful demonstrations outside Buckingham Palace, holding signs that read "Support our guards, support our veterans, and Thomas Reynolds is a hero." Former soldiers in wheelchairs and walking with canes joined younger veterans in showing solidarity with both James and Thomas. The demonstrations remained respectful, but sent a clear message that the military community supported Thomas' actions. Celebrity supporters began posting messages on social media praising Thomas' courage and calling for his reinstatement. Famous actors, musicians, and athletes who had military connections shared the story with their millions of followers, creating even more public pressure on palace authorities to reconsider Thomas' punishment. The pressure became so intense that senior palace officials realized they needed to brief members of the royal family about the developing situation. The monarchy, which always tried to stay above political controversies, found itself being drawn into a debate about veterans' rights and social responsibility that could affect public perception of the royal household. Behind closed doors, palace advisors worked frantically to find a solution that would satisfy public demands while maintaining the authority and dignity of the royal institution. They knew that appearing to reward someone for breaking rules could set dangerous precedents, but they also understood that punishing someone for helping a veteran could damage the monarchy's reputation for decades. As the day ended, it became clear that this story was not going to disappear quickly, and that palace authorities would need to make some difficult decisions about how to resolve the crisis. The fate of both Thomas and James had become intertwined with larger questions about how British society treats its veterans, and whether compassion should sometimes override bureaucratic rules. The palace found itself facing a test of its values and priorities that would be closely watched by millions of people both in Britain and around the world. By the third day, the story had become a national phenomenon that dominated news coverage across Britain. The online petition supporting Thomas had reached over 100,000 signatures and was still growing rapidly. Social media platforms were filled with messages of support for both Thomas and James, with many people sharing their own experiences of military service and the challenges faced by veterans returning to civilian life. Television talk shows dedicated entire programs to discussing the case, with panels of military experts, veterans advocates, and royal commentators debating the broader implications of Thomas' actions. Phone and radio programs were flooded with calls from listeners expressing their opinions about whether palace protocol was more important than helping fellow human beings in need. Major newspapers published editorial opinions supporting Thomas with headlines like "A guard's duty goes beyond protocol" and "True loyalty means never leaving a comrade behind." Even newspapers that usually supported traditional authority structures criticized the palace response and called for Thomas to be recognized as a hero rather than punished as a rule breaker. Veterans organizations across the country organized coordinated demonstrations at military bases, government buildings, and public squares in dozens of cities. Former soldiers wearing their old uniforms or military medals gathered to show solidarity with Thomas and James, while demanding better support for all veterans. The demonstrations remained peaceful, but their size and scope sent a powerful message to government officials and palace authorities. Celebrity support continued to grow as famous actors, musicians, and television personalities with military connections spoke out in favor of Thomas. Some celebrities visited James at his temporary shelter to show their support and bring more media attention to veterans' issues. Their involvement helped keep the story in the headlines and maintained public interest in the outcome. The pressure on palace authorities reached a critical point when several members of Parliament from different political parties issued a joint statement calling for Thomas' immediate reinstatement. The statement praised Thomas as an example of the finest British values and criticized palace officials for prioritizing bureaucratic rules over human compassion and military brotherhood. Government ministers responsible for veterans' affairs found themselves being questioned about why James' case had fallen through the cracks of the support system. Officials promised investigations and reforms, but many people felt that these were empty promises designed to reduce political pressure rather than genuine commitments to change. International media outlets picked up the story and began comparing the British treatment of veterans to policies in other countries. Some foreign commentators praised Thomas' courage, while others used the incident to criticize broader British social policies toward former military personnel and homeless citizens. The mounting pressure finally forced senior palace officials to brief members of the royal family about the crisis and seek guidance on how to proceed. Palace insiders reported that there were intense private discussions about how to resolve the situation without appearing to give in to public pressure, while also avoiding further damage to the monarch's reputation. Behind the scenes, palace advisors reached out to veterans organizations and military leaders to better understand the scope of the veterans' support problem and explore possible solutions. These private conversations revealed that James' situation was unfortunately typical of many former soldiers who struggled to access services and benefits they had earned through their military service. A breakthrough came when a senior member of the royal family who had military experience privately expressed support for Thomas' actions. This royal patron suggested that while Thomas had technically violated protocol, his behavior demonstrated exactly the kind of values and character that the monarchy wanted to represent to the public. Palace authorities began exploring options for resolving the crisis that would satisfy public demands while maintaining institutional authority. Ideas included giving Thomas a formal reprimand for breaking protocol, while simultaneously recognizing his compassion and dedication to helping fellow veterans. More importantly, palace officials began discussions with established veterans charities about creating a new initiative to ensure that former military personnel received better support and assistance. The proposal would allow the palace to demonstrate concern for veterans' issues while channeling future cases through proper official procedures. As the week progressed, it became clear that the palace was preparing to announce some kind of compromise solution that would address public concerns while attempting to restore confidence in royal institution procedures. The exact details remained secret, but sources suggested that both Thomas and James would benefit from whatever resolution was being developed. The intense public attention had transformed a simple story about one guard helping one veteran into a national conversation about social responsibility, military service, and the role of compassion in official institutions. Whatever happened next would set important precedents for how similar situations might be handled in the future. On Friday morning of the second week, palace officials finally announced their decision at a carefully planned press conference. The palace press secretary explained that after thorough consideration of all aspects of the situation, Thomas Reynolds would receive a formal written reprimand for violating established protocols by speaking to the media without authorization and for involving himself in civilian matters outside his assigned duties. However, the press secretary also announced that Thomas would simultaneously receive official recognition for demonstrating exceptional compassion and dedication to helping a fellow veteran in need. The palace statement emphasized that while proper procedures must be followed, Thomas' actions reflected the highest values of military service and British society. More significantly, the palace announced a new partnership with established veterans charities to create improved support systems for former military personnel who were struggling with housing, medical care, and benefits access. The initiative would be funded through private donations and would work closely with government agencies to ensure that veterans like James received prompt and effective assistance. James Mitchell was named as the first beneficiary of this new program, receiving not just immediate housing and financial support, but also access to specialized medical care and counseling services for the trauma and grief he had experienced. The program would also help him navigate the complex bureaucracy that had previously prevented him from accessing the benefits he had earned through his military service. The palace announcement was carefully crafted to show that the royal family cared deeply about veterans' issues, while also maintaining that proper channels existed for addressing such problems in the future. Officials emphasized that Thomas' case would serve as a learning experience that led to positive changes rather than simply a disciplinary matter. Public reaction to the palace decision was largely positive, with most people feeling that justice had been served for both Thomas and James. The online petition supporters celebrated the compromise as a victory that achieved their main goals of helping James and recognizing Thomas' courage. Veterans organizations praised the new support initiative as a meaningful step toward solving systemic problems. Thomas himself was relieved to learn that he would be allowed to return to his duties as a royal guard after completing his reprimand process. During a brief media statement outside his home, Thomas thanked the public for their support and emphasized that his primary concern had always been helping a fellow soldier who deserved better treatment from his country. James was overwhelmed with gratitude for the support he had received from both Thomas and the thousands of strangers who had rallied to his cause. In interviews from his new temporary apartment, James repeatedly praised Thomas as a true hero who had risked his career to help someone in desperate need. He also expressed hope that other veterans would benefit from the changes that resulted from his story. The new Veterans Support Program began operating immediately, with experienced social workers and military advocates working to identify other cases similar to James' situation. Within the first week, dozens of veterans came forward seeking help with housing benefits, access, and medical care. Many of these people had been struggling in silence before James' story gave them hope that assistance might finally be available. Sarah Henderson, the journalist who had first published the story, won several awards for her reporting on veterans' issues and the impact of James' case on British social policy. Her follow-up articles documented the early success of the new support program and highlighted additional reforms that were still needed to fully address veterans' problems. Thomas returned to his duties at Buckingham Palace with a new unofficial role as a liaison between the palace and veterans organizations. His commanding officers had initially been skeptical about his actions, but came to appreciate how his courage had led to positive changes that benefited many people. Other guards looked up to Thomas as someone who had proven that doing the right thing was sometimes more important than blindly following rules. The friendship between Thomas and James continued to grow stronger as they met regularly to discuss James' progress and the ongoing development of the Veterans Support Program. James often visited Thomas at the palace during his off-duty hours, and the two men would walk around London talking about their military experiences and their hopes for helping other veterans. Media attention gradually decreased as other news stories took priority, but the changes initiated by James' case continued to have lasting impact. The Veterans Support Program expanded to serve hundreds of people and became a model for similar initiatives in other parts of the country. As autumn approached, both Thomas and James reflected on how dramatically their lives had changed since that first conversation outside the palace gates. What had begun as a simple act of kindness between two soldiers had grown into a movement that helped countless other veterans receive the support and recognition they deserved. 6 months after the media storm had ended, both Thomas and James had settled into new routines that reflected the profound changes in their lives. James had moved into a comfortable one-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood of London, where he kept Sarah's photograph on his bedside table next to letters from veterans who had been helped by the support program that bore his name. Every morning, James would wake up in his own bed for the first time in over a year and prepare breakfast in his small kitchen while listening to the radio news. The simple pleasure of having his own space and privacy had helped him begin the long process of healing from the trauma and grief that had nearly destroyed his life. James had started attending counseling sessions that helped him work through his feelings about Sarah's death and his own struggle with homelessness. The specialized medical care James received through the Veterans Program had diagnosed and begun treating the post-traumatic stress disorder that had gone unrecognized for years after his military service. With proper medication and therapy, James found that he could sleep better at night and felt more hopeful about his future than he had since Sarah's illness began. Most importantly, James had found new purpose in his life by working part-time with the Veterans Support Program, helping other former soldiers navigate the complex systems that had once defeated him. His personal experience with homelessness and bureaucratic failures made him uniquely qualified to understand what other veterans were going through and to guide them toward the help they needed. James received letters and emails from veterans across Britain, and even from other countries, telling him how his story had inspired them to seek help or had led to improvements in veteran services in their areas. These messages reminded James that his painful experience had created something positive that would help many other people avoid similar struggles. Thomas had returned to his full duties as a Royal Guard, but his role had expanded to include representing the palace at veterans' events and serving as an unofficial advocate for military personnel who needed assistance. Palace officials had come to appreciate how Thomas' actions had enhanced the monarchy's reputation for caring about social issues and supporting those who served their country. The formal reprimand in Thomas' personnel file had become a source of pride rather than shame, as it represented his willingness to risk his career for his principles. Fellow guards looked up to Thomas as someone who had proven that true loyalty sometimes required breaking rules to do what was morally right. Thomas had become a mentor to younger guards, teaching them that their duties extended beyond following orders to include showing compassion for those in need. Thomas continued to receive recognition for his actions, including invitations to speak at military academies and veterans events about the importance of looking out for fellow soldiers. These speaking engagements had helped Thomas develop confidence in public settings and had given him opportunities to advocate for additional improvements in veteran services. The friendship between Thomas and James had deepened into something like brotherhood as they met every week for coffee to discuss James' progress and the ongoing development of veterans programs. Their conversations often turned to memories of their military service and their shared understanding of the bonds that connected all soldiers regardless of when or where they had served. Both men took pride in the lasting changes that had resulted from their decision to share James' story with the world. The Veterans Support Program had helped over 300 people in its first 6 months and had inspired similar initiatives in other regions. Government funding for veteran services had increased and new policies had been implemented to prevent cases like James from falling through bureaucratic cracks. James had begun dating a woman named Margaret who worked as a nurse at the medical clinic where he received treatment. Margaret understood James' grief over losing Sarah and supported his gradual return to social activities and relationships. James felt that Sarah would approve of his new friendship and his efforts to build a meaningful life after tragedy. Thomas had been promoted to senior sergeant and was being considered for additional leadership responsibilities within the Royal Guard. His superiors had concluded that his moral courage and independent thinking made him valuable for handling situations that required judgment and compassion rather than just following standard procedures. On the anniversary of their first meeting, Thomas and James returned to the spot outside Buckingham Palace where James had spent those difficult months waiting for someone to notice his situation. They stood together looking at the busy tourists and guards while reflecting on how much their lives had changed since that cold morning when a simple conversation between two soldiers had set in motion events that helped hundreds of other veterans. James thanked Thomas once again for seeing him as a person rather than just another homeless man, and for having the courage to risk everything to help someone in need. Thomas replied that James had taught him that true service to country meant never abandoning fellow citizens who had sacrificed for the common good. As they walked away from the palace gates, both men felt grateful for the friendship they had found and proud of the positive changes they had created together. Their story had become proof that ordinary people could make extraordinary differences when they chose compassion over convenience and moral courage over personal safety.